And I always think it's so exciting. There it goes. I always think it's so fun to do these. Hi, everyone who's joining us. Happy Halloween. That's what we should all say to people too.
I know.
Happy
Happy
Halloween.
Halloween, everyone.
If you have
I
any good
was,
costumes, drop it in the chat. We want to know what people are dressing up as.
and I was nearly the only one all dressed up. So luckily we found a little alternative for now to
Yeah,
still stay on
your
theme.
hat is
Yeah.
awesome, Nadia. I
Nadia
was
had a
very jealous.
costume. Yeah, I did not. I do think my celebrity costume would have worked, Nadia. Celebrity in disguise.
And they wouldn't have
Incognito.
known it was you. It would have been like, is this Hebba or is it
Yeah.
someone else?
Is it? I learned this time that apparently the celebrities call the paparazzi to take pictures of them. I didn't know that was a thing. I thought the paparazzi just always knew where they were going. Just ruined
Yeah.
it for me. So now I know if I want to be celeb shot, I gotta call paparazzi to take pictures of me.
The only on-brand Halloween costume for me is a pilot's uniform. So
I
Yes.
love that. I love it. Okay, well, I think we're letting a few more people in, like 60 more seconds. If you can drop in the chat what you're dressing up as for Halloween, if you want to share with us, please do. If you're joining us and you have questions at any time throughout our discussion, you can drop them in the Q&A at the bottom. I feel like everyone knows how to use Zoom now, so when I'm giving cues, I just automatically give Zoom cues. But we used to use a different software to do some of our webinars, and people got so confused the second we were like in a different software. And I was like, Zoom. Oh, chat is disabled. Oh, thank you, Kim, for sharing that. Matt, do you think you can turn the chat on?
do we want to have chat on with everyone? We have Q&A enabled, I think, but I can try to do chat.
Maybe. We'll
Um,
see. Maybe you can just drop your questions in Q&A.
yeah.
Cool. Okay, well, we're going to have some fun today. I will, while Matt's figuring that out, I'll just kick us off quickly. If you're joining us, we're so happy you're here. Thank you for making time for us on Halloween, which I know if you're a parent can be very stressful in the States. I just learned that in Nadia's neighborhood, they pick specific days for them to trick or treat on.
Always
I'm
on a weekend.
I'm
Always on a
shook by that.
weekend. So
They are
weird.
like,
Yeah.
we're not messing with the flow of traffic. You are either trick or treating on a weekend or you're not trick or treating. I love that. I honestly think it might be better. Um, and I will kick us off. We have about, half a few of us here and 2 minutes over. But thank you for making time for us on Halloween, parents, or anybody else who just wants to bug off of work and go trick or treating. I myself would love to do that. I'm excited for us to all be here today and have this conversation. You'll see Matt and Nadia are joining us, and they'll introduce themselves as well. But when we started talking about things that are happening in the world and how we're thinking about growing and scaling companies and where we stand right now, we started having this conversation about global hiring and like really trying to debunk what it is HR people are dealing with, founders as they're trying to navigate how do I grow and scale my company, and maybe I want to access global talent. So we had a lot of conversation about that and decided to put together this webinar to chat a bit more about, trends we're seeing, misconceptions we've heard, hopefully to leave you all with tips and tricks to get all your questions answered. There's the Q&A at the bottom. But before we get into our discussion today, I would love for panelists to introduce themselves. I'll start. I'm Hebba Youssef. I'm the Chief People Officer at Workweek. I have hired internationally a few times, and every time I'm always terrified that I've messed something up. I don't think that feeling ever goes away. And when I'm not chief people officering, I'm a content creator. I've created I Hate It Here, and I write that every week, twice a week. And I get to do fun things like put together this panel and chat with people and basically get a bunch of information in the hands of HR people when we all direly need it. So I'm excited to be here and I'm pumped for this conversation. Matt, do you want to introduce yourself to the group?
All right. And I think I got the chat going, by the way. I think it
Okay.
should work now. So, Lindsay, thanks for dropping this in, and we'll see how this goes. And we might have to moderate the chat, so we'll see how that
I will
goes.
not.
All right, fantastic. So I'm Matt. I'm the founder and CEO at Plane. I'm based out of Las Vegas these days. I was in San Francisco for a long while, and in my free time, I just like going hiking in the desert. So that's my favorite thing to do.
Nice. Good.
I love that.
So nice to be on a panel with both of you. I'm Nadia Vatalidis. I am currently Interim Director of Talent Acquisition at Camunda. Been loving this year while my amazing peer is on parental leave. And I'm actually currently looking for my next role. So exciting times to be interviewing and going back hopefully to a VP of People role in the near future. I come from remote.com and GitLab and been working remotely in the world of people, culture, talent acquisition for a decade. Can't believe I'm saying that. I just remember the other day where people still ask me, do you really have a job on the internet and you've never met your colleagues? So yeah, here we are, 2024, out here in Johannesburg, sunny South Africa. And it's 8 p.m. here, so I feel like if it was trick-or-treating, it would have been over already, which is good.
Yeah, or just starting. You never know with teenagers. I love that you have worked remotely so many times too. I do feel like the first time you meet your colleagues in person, it's always like so jarring. You're like, oh, I've only ever seen you from like the hip up. I never know what I'm doing with my hands. I'm like, what am I even doing here? Okay, I am stoked to get into this conversation today. I already see the chat is going off. People are connecting, so great. I'll be monitoring it and catching the Q&A. So if you have any questions in Q&A, drop them in there. But I want to start talking a bit about like just current trends we're observing in global hiring. I think it's been a really interesting 4 years since the pandemic, where we've heard a lot about everyone picking up their lives or moving and living in other places. And I just kind of want to get a pulse check on what are some current trends we're seeing now in global hiring.
Yeah. So I'll put some historical context to this. So if you think about the sort of what we've seen is up until 2020, slow build up towards remote. Not a lot of companies doing remote. We have some remote veterans on this call, but it was, by far not the default path, right? Then we had 2020. Effectively a mandatory trial for remote for all of the companies out there, right? Like you don't have a choice. You're going to give this a shot and we're going to see what happens, right? And then as sort of the restrictions started to ease, we've seen, I think, a pullback from a lot of remote, from a lot of sort of like global hiring people saying, okay, we need everyone back in the office. Everyone's going to be in the same room. And you've sort of seen, I think, an understandable sort of retraction from what we've seen at sort of the peak of the pandemic, right? And I think what we're starting to see now is a bit of a rebound of that. I think that's accelerated by companies just wanting to be a lot more efficient, right? So the theme for the past couple of years in the sort of post-ZERP era is we just want to be lean and mean, right? So what a lot of companies are doing these days is I think trying to use being global as an edge to be able to access more talent, better talent, lower cost talent in a lot of places. So we're seeing, I think, a lot of companies being built with a very small core team and then pulling in people from across Latin America, from across Central Eastern Europe, Canada, the Philippines, just trying to create a more global pool of employees that they have and figure out how they can build sort of more efficient, stronger teams, but not sort of overgrow in the same way that we've sort of seen overgrowth throughout the pandemic, because they might have to, whatever money they got, whatever money they raised, whatever money they were able to get from the customers, they have to get to break even on that money because they don't know that there is not enough money just sloshing around unless maybe you're in AI that you can sort of bank on being able to just raise. And that I think is causing people to think differently about how they build their companies and go global more often than not. At least that's what I'm seeing, Nadia. Is that you seeing something similar?
Yeah. If I had a cat in the hat outfit, I would have said, well, the cat's out the bag, because you just said it, right? It's the what do you call it? The competitor landscape is no longer just about how you're doing against your competition, but it's actually, bottom line is cost. And if you can hire anywhere, it's absolutely genius to lean into locations where you can actually afford to hire and scale, but not doing it at that scale we've seen a few years ago, because you obviously have to control your headcount costs. And if you control that properly and you start strategically thinking about where you can hire folks within specific budgets or cost constraints that you might have, you're gonna outwin your competitors due to you managing your costs correctly. And so you're right, it's also about ARR. And I can't even tell you how many founders I've advised, I would say in the last probably 24 to 48 months, so 2 to 4 years, that specifically is working on that ARR stretch. How do we get from, I don't know, 4 million ARR to 10 million, 10 million to 25, 25 to 100, whatever those stretches look like. And usually it comes down to, well, if you're going to go global and start thinking about that global footprint instead of your own 30-kilometer radius, it just has such a great impact. I think something else I've just realized and thought about is the amount of jobs you can do remotely has increased tremendously since we all had to do it, right? So I think for me, just observing this now over a decade, so many people that said, well, I can't do my job remotely because, and then would give me all these, you know, fancy reasons. That's just changed, including at like big 5 audit companies that often said they can't do it. And so even like the most amazing tax directors in the world is working from the comfort of their own homes and doing really well while doing it, right? Productive, happy, engaged, retained. Yeah. So I think those are some of the trends I've seen.
And I think if you think about this sort of like, you know, where can you hire, what can you afford, etc., you can make this decision of, would I rather hire the top, you know, 1 to 5% of people in broader geography where the sort of like average salaries are lower, or do I get the sort of, you know, do I get the mid-tier talent in a really expensive location, right? And I think people are really thinking through that decision of like, I would rather have fewer amazing people pay, you know, top of market in some of these locations and get the absolutely best talent. That's kind of another strategy that I've seen a bunch of companies employ.
Yeah, I've seen this like really interesting push and pull between like return to office and companies that started building remotely from the start. And as we all shift to this like hyper focus on profitability, I feel like every single HR person, if you're like in an early stage venture backed startup, is talking about like, how do I get the company profitable? It's like looking at one of your biggest drivers of cost, which is your people. And so I think like we're in this position of HR leaders like have to be really smart about how you grow and scale a company. And that means looking outside of just like the typical places where you would hire people and really thinking holistically about like your global footprint.
Yeah, great timing for budget season.
Yeah.
It's Q4. So which tech company isn't going through budget season right now?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, great timing to be talking about these things right now.
I know. And then I think with that, like those are the trends we've observed. But then there's a bit of like misconceptions that I hear a lot when it comes to hiring globally. Oh, it's too hard. Oh, I don't know how to do it. Oh, it's so legally challenging. So I kind of want to dig into that too, because I'm sure there are people on this call who have heard those misconceptions or maybe are a bit scared of hiring globally. So Nadia, what is your take on that?
Yeah, I think the number one stressor, I think a lot of the people teams are relatively lean, right? I've seen people team sizes from 1 to maybe 3. And then in mass scaling organizations, maybe they have a larger team, but that came over time, that came with a massive headcount, etc. But if you look at the average, I don't know, series A to maybe C, under 500, very small people or very lean. I think the biggest stress factor or misconception is you have to do it all at once. And I think like I'm guilty of that. Back early days at GitLab, when I looked at the challenge of hiring globally, we were literally scaling from, I don't know, 75 people to at that stage, probably 800 people. I think my biggest concern was like, how the heck am I going to know when to open an entity, when to, you know, engage someone like Matt or Plain or remote, or there were so many options and I just had no idea how to do it. And I think once I started setting boundaries and started looking at prioritization, started looking at risks, we also decided what kind of risks we wanted to take as an organization and then start having a plan that's tapered. I think that's the biggest misconception. You do not have to do this all at once. You can decide to take on certain risks. Those risks will come potentially with consequences and potentially not come with significant consequences, depending on the risk, right? And so I think it's about allowing yourself and the company to figure out what is the business goal? Is there buy-in to take this risk on right now? What are the risks we're comfortable with? What are the risks we're not comfortable with that can land us in incredibly hot labor law water? and then taper it out of time. Set realistic goals per quarter to figure out, are you going to convert to a contractor model? Do you want independent contractors? Are these people registered to have their own companies? Or are you going full on EOR or entities, right? And so I think all of them come with a set of challenges. I don't think that any of them are without challenges, but I think with scaling it comes a bit of realizing that you can't do it all at once. And if you do, you're probably going to fail a few times before you find a model that works for you.
Yeah.
And I
So
think
that
we
was one
should
of my
prefix.
Yeah.
And I think we should prefix all of this with we're not lawyers, we're not employment lawyers, this is not legal advice, right? I mean, we're just talking about what we're seeing out there, and you should make, your own decisions as HR professionals, company leaders on what are you comfortable with. Educate yourself. Like, I think that's critical in this process, right?
Yeah. What other, Matt, any other misconceptions about hiring globally that you've heard?
Yeah, I think I really like Nadia's one on, like you don't have to be perfect from day one. It's sort of a riff off of that. I think a lot of companies think that like the moment you make the smallest possible mistake, you're gonna have like regulators on your back and like someone trying to like arrest you, and it's again in reality, I think local authorities are focused on bigger companies first and foremost, right? Companies that are sort of blatant violators of a lot of these laws. A lot of the companies that sort of rely on, I think we've all heard stories of like Uber getting in trouble for the drivers, right? And how they get classified globally. But Uber is a massive company and they're very visibly using this sort of contractor model in a way that if you're a, small marketing agency, nobody's knocking on your door, right? Extremely unlikely. So I think you don't have to be perfect, right? You can sort of start to put good foundations, good processes in place. And then as your company grows, you end up tightening some of the things that maybe in the beginning you just didn't know how to do, right? So I think that's really important. And I think for me, the one misconception that comes with that is that also a lot of sort of US-based HR professionals assume that the sort of like rules and level of strictness that they know from the US will apply globally, right? And first, the US regulators have nothing to do really with your non-US staff. So if you're hiring folks in another market, what you really need to be concerned with is the local laws and local regulations, not the US labor law, right? And also, in a lot of these places, take a different philosophy around sort of worker classification, right? From they don't have a view, or places like China where there really isn't a sort of an independent contractor classification at all, to places that don't really draw very strict lines between an employer and a contractor, and they don't have very clear rules on how to assess, are you an independent contractor, are you an employee, all the way through to countries which have published, 7 to 12 point tests that you can just look at and be like, okay, do I meet these criteria? Do I meet 5 out of 7 of those? And therefore this person can be sort of classified as an independent contractor versus an employee, right? So it's a really big world with a lot of really complicated rules. And the sort of like approach that you're used to from your local market, say the US, will not always apply in a lot of other geographies. And a lot of places are honestly a lot more relaxed about this than I think the US is. They either have very clear rules that say, if you meet these, criteria, you can consider this person a contractor, or they don't have rules at all around this. And it's sort of like, does this seem like this person can be considered a contractor? Yes or no, right? And many places oftentimes actually encourage independent contractors. They sort of see this as a form of entrepreneurship, right? And they have tax codes that encourage people to be self-employed. They have rules that encourage companies to hire people as independent contractors. So you kind of have to throw some of that sort of concern that people have that's sort of very US focused out of the door when hiring in a lot of places.
Yeah, and it's becoming more socially acceptable. In Poland, for example, even governments, something I observed sort of between, I would say, 2021 and 2023, so during my time at Remote, remote.com, something I observed there was there were governments coming on this journey with us. And so if you look at nomad visas, just how much that is expanded. I know that's not going to give you like a full-time, right to work, but the opportunity to become that true nomad and travel in locations like Croatia, Czech Republic, Poland, Greece, Hawaii,
Wow.
and they have these amazing community-centered projects that you can get involved in. So not only are you able to work anywhere and you're busy hiring in all these locations as an employer, but you're also growing a country's economy and changing, and I really want to say that local market with them. And so we actually saw a shift in how governments started thinking about this and the fact that they came on this journey with us. Here in South Africa, what's interesting is we had like just a city that decided they wanted to do a nomad visa, right? Cape Town. And that fascinated me being out here in Johannesburg in a country with 55 million people, right? And that it excites me that those options are becoming available. So I will also say, I think those barriers are changing. I think the viewpoints in governmental agencies, they're starting to realize the opportunity for people. There's still years, probably, hopefully not, but probably decades of work to be done in that space. And thank goodness I'm not responsible for that. But at the same time, it's really exciting to also see those viewpoints change. Yeah, so I agree everything with what Matt said as well. It makes total sense.
Matt, you brought up such an interesting point because I feel like, and don't get mad at me, HR people, about this. A lot of HR people are rule followers. So when you tell us like you have to assess the risk and figure out like the laws are different, and like I feel like a lot of HR people are like, oh no, I have to do it by the book. And I think that ends up being a big misconception that actually holds us back from really trying to hire globally. I see somebody say they love rules. Like it happens, right? Like when my CEO comes to me and asks me to do something, I'm also filtering through like what are the laws and rules I need to make sure he's aware of. But I do think you bring up a good point where it's like you don't have to be able to do everything perfectly. Like you just have to get started and you will find resources that will help you, people that will connect you, software that you can use, vendors that can guide you. I just think with HR, a lot of people definitely want to follow the rules. And I think the second piece of that is I feel like with a lot of vendors, it's like very cloak and daggery where they're like, oh, totally, we can be your EOR and like there are no hidden fees and just hire this person and do it this way. And here's what we recommend. And all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, I'm doing something that I don't feel like I'm the expert in. I don't know all the laws and rules. And this vendor is like just telling me kind of what to do and I don't know what to trust. So I think that's a big misconception that I see a lot of HR people grappling with where they're like, is this vendor going to lead me in the right direction or maybe the wrong direction? How do I know?
Yeah. And I think on the rules point, what's really interesting is that, and this is sort of segueing maybe a little bit into career advice for HR professionals, but this is sort of what I think you see in a lot of, if you think about legal or compliance or, HR to an extent, you sort of think about, as a, sort of from the CEO's perspective, you think of these as functions that tell you no within the company, Yeah. And I think once you start working with folks that are maybe a little bit further ahead on their journey and are able to think about this a little bit more strategically, they really start to help you do more with your business, right? And once you start to have this type of partnership with your HR leader and they're trying to help you grow your business and do it in a safe way instead of just telling you can't do this, you can't do that, amazing things happen, right? And I think for a lot of folks in HR, I think you have to be able to toe this line. And I think great lawyers can do this too, right? Where they're able to tell you, hey, these are the laws that we're operating within. These are the constraints. Here is what we can do safely. Here is what we can do if we take a little bit of risk, and here is what the risks are, and if we hit any of these points, here's how we would recover, right? And this is where, in HR, you have some of the same things, right? Where you think about the rules that you have, and obviously there's so many regulations out there. No company is 100% compliant with every single rule. This is just, it's impossible, right? So what the sort of HR leader's role is knowing, okay, which of these rules are like really, really important, which are critical, which carry the heaviest penalties, which are most heavily enforced, right? And focus on making sure that you're good on those, right? And then pick your battles as a business, right? Obviously, if you're, say, a non-profit, you're going to have a lot more scrutiny on your box and how you do certain things. You might have lower risk tolerance than a 5-person startup that's just getting off the ground. And there is a decent chance that before any regulator is able to get to you, you might not exist as a business anymore, right? So all of this, complying with all of the rules, it doesn't really help you, right? If your business is not going to be a going concern, right? So I think leaders always have to think through these in order of priority, right? If your company is not going to be around, what's the point, So I think, quite frankly.
No, we're playing that game every day, honestly. Like, I'm assessing the risk. I'm trying to understand if it's what's best for the business, if it's what's holding us back. Like, I hear the feedback from so many CEOs, like, I don't want traditional HR. I want somebody who is going to be able to talk to me about where I can have like impact, where there is some flexibility versus someone just telling me, here's how to perfectly do everything. Because you're right, it's impossible for us to be fully compliant all the time.
Something that I've been toggling with for years is I love a people first model. But why is it that so many folks in the world of HR and people are completely okay with the rules we're breaking when we're people first, right?
Yeah.
But not when it comes to these like extremely regulated type of policymakers. And so sometimes I think about these things and I'm like, well, we have unlimited PTO, and actually in these 15 countries, that's completely unheard of, right? And it's really difficult to navigate. And legally, you still have to submit your time off, even if you're not capturing it right now. And so if you're willing to let that go, then I think there's certain risks for that business trajectory and alignment that you must take. I'll also say, I love thinking forward. And as someone that has sat in that seat of risk for a while and that has helped companies all the way through to, hitting IPO, I think as long as you have a plan and you understand the heavy lifting that's going to come if you do decide to, for example, IPO, or if there's a major acquisition and there's going to be all these compliance boxes to check, right? Then it's time to like get your house in order very quickly. But I think unless you understand the business trajectory and you understand like where are we going in the next year, we need to get to 25 million ARR, and if we don't, we have a problem, right? Then it's more about, okay, what can I do in my function to set the company up for success? Where can I hire to reduce major headcount costs and still have access to the world's best talent, right? And I think those are the trade-offs you have to make. We are not just policymakers. And if we are, we're doing something wrong, right? And so I think, that's a good point.
Not my dream job.
And there's people first sort of, trade-offs against that happen with things like worker classification too. How many times have you had an employee come to you in a lot of foreign markets and they'll be like, I'd rather be a contractor. I don't want to be an employee. In fact, if you try to convert me from a contractor to an employee, I will quit. I've been on many conversations like this, and then you have to think about, do I do what's right for this person, what they want, what is people first, or do I do what, is removing 100% of the worker classification risk, right? And there's different answers to this question depending on what your business is, what your risk tolerance is, your stage of the business, right? But a lot of the time, you will have dilemmas like this that you'll have to work through.
Yeah. And I think it's just like a game of chess every day. It feels like HR is like, if I make this move, then I have to know this move. And I say like, we're some of the most strategic people and strategic function out there because we have to think about these and like weigh them properly.
Yeah. There's another fear, and that's probably cost through EORs and vendors and other providers. And I don't know if anyone has said this out loud, so I'm going to say it today, and salespeople of the world, like, don't hate me, but you can negotiate with any vendor. And I am that person. So if you're
Unless it's
struggling,
plain, don't
reach out
negotiate
to
with
me.
us.
No, don't negotiate with plain. Their costs are so good. No, there's always a bit of room. I mean, the way these costs are calculated, these companies also have to become profitable, and they obviously have a ton of expenses themselves. But I think on the cost front, find out where your lever is, and find out, if cost is what's holding you back, because that has been a fear of mine. That's certainly been a fear of many of my peers. It's like, have that hard conversation with your vendor and see, can they go on this journey? Can you start converting over time if you genuinely need that EOR or that contractor conversion or that payroll system that you might not have today? And negotiate through that. Because obviously your CEO or your leadership team is also going to push you in terms of cost. And that does impact your headcount cost, unfortunately, because it adds that additional cost to your per employee. Yeah.
One thing I always try to encourage customers to think through is that the sort of the fees that your EOR provider is going to charge you are honestly the least of your worries and probably the least important of these costs. They are something that you should negotiate. I mean, I agree as much as I prefer if our customers don't do this. But the commitment that you make in terms of, being able to let that employee go if they're underperforming or change their salary, things like that, when you bring someone on the EOR model, especially in countries with stricter labor laws, that's honestly much more important thing to think through than the fees, right? And what I've seen in the past is companies kind of getting into, well, where, like your EOR provider might be really trying to win your business, and they might be willing to offer a really low attractive rate to get you to convert, folks from contractors to employees. And even if that is not a cost issue for you, I would say think twice whether this is a good decision for your business, right? Because you might not be able to let this person go. You lose a lot of flexibility when you convert folks from contractors to employees, and only really make that decision if you're willing to potentially spend not just a sort of a year's worth of fees on the sort of the EOR service that you're buying, but potentially a year's worth of this employee's salary on severance and termination costs, which are not something that the EOR provider is usually just pulling out of thin air. These are like real sort of like expenses that you would likely need to incur, even if you had your own legal entity and country, to avoid litigation, right? And I think a lot of people don't think through the sort of the hidden costs of the EOR model. And I'm not even talking, I'm not talking about hidden fees. I'm not talking about things that like, your EOR provider might be trying to sort of pass on to you or screw you over with. It's the costs of bringing someone on as a permanent employee in jurisdictions which have strong labor protections, and the probability that you'll have to pay many times over their monthly salary if things go south. That's the real, I think, hidden cost, and a real, I think, justified fear when it comes to the EOR model. That I think you really need to think about, and this is why one of the things that I love about the sort of the sales culture that we've been able to create at Plane is like we don't try to push you down the EOR path, because we know there's like real risks and costs associated with it that honestly like we don't get to benefit from. If you're unhappy because you can't let this employee go because that's the law in France, we just have an unhappy customer and nobody's happy, so think twice, before you pursue the EOR path.
You said France, and Nadia and I both tensed up because that is my most terrified country to hire in. But it's like so true. Before we hired anyone internationally, what I like to do is I'll pull the manager aside and I'll say, let's just like walk through. One, there's the cost, put that aside. You should read up on what it takes to like hire this person. And you should also understand, and I know this is like maybe a little dark, I want every manager to understand what it would actually take to fire the person as well. Because like in America, the labor laws are more employer friendly, except in certain states. I would say globally, potentially they're more employee friendly. And that shift especially if you're like an American-based manager, is hard to understand. Like, what do you mean I can't fire that person? What do you mean I need to give them X amount of notice? What do you mean it could take me up to a year of their salary? Like, I don't understand that. And so I think when you bring your managers on board, having them really understand, okay, if we go down the EOR, here are the risks we incur. Also, the contractor model is so friendly and helpful. And I always find it funny when people want to make people employees and not contractors. I'm like, there's benefits to everybody when they also stay as contractors that I think a lot of people don't think of. They just think employee benefits. That's what I want to give them. It's fascinating. Anyways, okay, wait, hold on. We have more questions. I don't want to get too sidetracked because we just started talking about this already. Challenges. I really want to talk about, we've touched on a few, but more challenges that companies face when they're really trying to navigate different labor markets.
Oh man, I have so many stories on this now.
I know the two of you are like, I have the list.
I know. Yeah, it's insane. I mean, honestly, like one of the reasons why we started playing was precisely because I run into so many issues, right? I think when I started my first company out of college, I hired globally because nobody told me not to. I was just, I kind of grew up on the internet and worked with a lot of people across borders in a sort of non-professional way. And so when I started a company and I needed to bring some folks on board, it was the friends and people that I've met and folks that I just, I was like, okay, well, we're going to work online. That's, everyone's online. Everything's online right now. Why isn't work online, And it honestly, it was this sort of naivety of just not knowing, that it's like, well, I'll just do it. And, if someone tells me I need to do something differently, maybe I'll think about it then. And, thankfully it's worked out for the best, but we very quickly sort of realized how much friction there is to a lot of these things, when I started my first company, I was in the UK and, my first employee was in Greece. My second employee was in Poland. We worked across 3 different time zones. And outside of the logistical challenges of just getting work done in a distributed way, we also had to battle with things of how do I pay this person? Can I just wire them money? My bank does not do international wires unless I physically go into the branch, which I kid you not, I've heard this from customers. Yep. Just maybe within the last year or two, where they told me I don't hire people globally as contractors because if I wanted to pay them, my bank has me physically go into a branch and fill out paperwork. And I was like, I'm not surprised you're not doing this because this sounds insane, So it's things like that. It's how do I literally pay this? How do I hire this person? What is the legal agreement that I signed with them? And how do I make sure that I'm not violently breaking local laws, right? Yeah. Then how do I actually get them paid, And we sort of think that it's just, paying people is easy. You just go to your bank and pay them. But again, your bank might have you go into a branch in person. Even if they can let you do international transfers, the person on the receiving end will likely receive a fraction of that payment, right, due to SWIFT sort of intermediary bank fees, right? So how do I make sure that they get paid in full? And then you sort of go into geographies that have currency restrictions, foreign capital restrictions, and you start to see how just moving money around the world globally, how difficult that is, and it's oh, maybe we can pay this person, but only as an individual, but not as a business, and only in this currency, but not that currency. And it's very quickly starts to snowball into something that takes up the sort of HR's leaders a day or two a month just to wrangle payments and the kind of the logistics of getting people paid. So those are honestly those are one of the first things that we set out to fix at Plane. And how do you collect bank account details from people in countries where you might not even know what the local bank account format is, or the local bank account format that they use is different than what your bank needs to initiate a global wire, right? And it's your bank's telling me, oh, it's just account number. And the local contractor or the local employee tells me, no, we have a branch code and an institution number. And and we use PIX, so it's just an email address, right? In Brazil, for example. And it's what? So lots of really interesting snags that we've hit over the many years that I've run global teams, and at some point we're just like, I don't want to ever have to deal with this again. We're just gonna fix this and have other people be able to take advantage of that.
I love that the origin story of Plane was a real challenge that you were actually experiencing, because all of that happens. And I actually like can't think about when I submit payroll, like how the money is going everywhere. It's kind of wild to me. Like everything is online, but like even just paying people in their local currency, the challenges are so vast. And I think the average HR person, one, I don't think should be spending their time trying to figure these things out. And like two, there are bigger things we need to worry about. But at the end of the day, it comes back to that people first thing that Nadia keeps coming back to, right? Like you want your people to be paid in a timely manner where they're not incurring a million fees and it's not in the account that they want. So I just love that the origin story of Plane is a real challenge you actually felt, because that just means that like so many other people are probably feeling it too. Nadia, challenges you have faced when you're thinking about navigating global markets.
When I was thinking about right in the beginning of the call where we were talking about like the mistakes, like that fear of just making a mistake, right?
Yeah.
I just remembered like very early on in my global career, just not knowing how long it takes to transact, right, into global payments, and then literally not sleeping because this person wasn't paid on time because the global transaction takes, I don't know, like 7 days. That's how
Yeah.
ridiculous it used to be, right? And just not knowing these things and eventually finding experts that has solved this problem. I think the pain of that, like Matt, you said something earlier, like that EOR cost shouldn't even be a factor. The pain of that
Yeah.
was so worth me handing that over, even on a contract model when I did that in certain environments. But I think just not knowing, paying people late, having to explain that you didn't know that the transaction is going to take that long, or an accountant or payroll person simply didn't know. But
Yeah.
I think that there's just so much more to that story. I think the other challenge for me was, Matt, you touched on this, is where people just didn't want to convert. I literally have had situations where I would sit in front of amazing people and peers and people that I loved working with that took like a little bit of a class action against the people team to say like, hi, we now have a spokesperson and spokesperson's going to tell you what our thoughts are. And one person in the country would be like, so we don't want to convert. And yeah, that's our story today. And I'll be like, we have to convert. This is a country that contains the following risks. And they'd just be like, I'm not willing to give up 41% of my salary to income taxes in this country. And then everyone else would be like, I'm not willing either. And so working through those challenges and then starting to understand those social norms of where, actively listening to where people are coming from and slowing the process down a little bit has also even helped me have such meaningful conversations with compensation, total rewards folks, right? To say like, I understand what we paid these folks for the last 4 years seemed like according to data. But if we do this, this is what they're losing, and this is the impact on their bottom line. Can we absorb a cost? Can we meet them halfway? And to be honest, those conversations are super difficult, but it doesn't mean you don't need to have it. So I think, just touching on that human factor, people, once you have a big team in one country, the problem does eventually grow. And just setting good boundaries of what is that limit? Is it 3 people? Is it 5 people in a country before you start converting to contractor model or EOR? Or do you just do contractor model, through a vendor from the start? I think if I had to start a company today, I would sure as hell not do it on my own. I would really start thinking about a good vendor where I can start tapering those plans, right? Over quarters, absorbing the costs over time. But I think, those are the challenges. There's this person on the other side that's been working in this country for 12 years in a specific model. And now you're telling them, oh, based on your labor law, you can't do this. And it's like, really? But I've been doing it. And I can also do it at these 15 other companies, right? And so it's just learning through those challenges, really actively listening to the issue, and then finding a solution one way or the other, or finding 5 solutions and then picking one.
Well, that's perfect, because it leads me.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Hebba.
I think you're going to say
I
the
was going to
exact.
say, well, I wasn't going to say that. I wasn't going to go as self-promotional, maybe. But what I was going to say is I think we could have another separate webinar on
Yeah.
just compensation, quite frankly,
Yes.
because
Yes.
there's like so many very deep questions with no single good answer just around compensation, right? Do I think about someone's total comp, including the employer cost, or just gross
Mm.
salary? Do I think about how much they net? Do I think about adjusting that for cost of living? Like, what is fair? What is a fair salary when you have folks working on the same level in the same engineering sort of ladder across different countries? We've sort of explored these questions at Plane, just even for our own team. And it almost starts to become a very philosophical discussion. So I think if people have the appetite for something like that, you should ping Hebba, and
We should do this. Yeah.
maybe we should do this as a separate conversation.
Honestly, selfishly, I really want you to do it so I can learn a lot about it too. And people are already saying yes, please in the chat. We've now
Fantastic.
teased that. Okay, but before we get to that, maybe we'll do that another part. I want to end with I love ending with like options for solutions out there. So people who have been listening to this, they've heard our misconceptions, our challenges, what we're facing. What are some options they can actually go lean on when they are trying to hire globally?
Hopefully we haven't scared everyone off from doing this,
We've
That's
not. No, no, no. No, I hope not. What are some options, Nadia? What do you think that people could lean on? And you've used a few, so please let us know.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me is if you're building a business case, if I have to think of five things, right? If you're building a business case, what are those five things that I would present? You can present 15, but I would focus on like the top five. And I think going into the conversation with we need 24/7 coverage because that means while someone is sleeping, someone else is on the line with a customer or support or whatever that looks like. An engineer can be busy building a feature while other engineers are getting rest or spending time with their family or practicing a hobby. I think that asynchronous coverage and that global world is a business case that should be put first. I don't think enough HR people are thinking around that.
Yeah.
I also think it's a huge competitive advantage. So I think if I start thinking about just looking at a competitor that's hiring in a 30-kilometer radius, or how many ads have you seen that's US remote only or UK remote only, right? Just the
Mhm.
competitive advantage you're creating by hiring globally means all your competitors, team members, employees, contractors is going to want to work for you with all that knowledge and skills and competencies. Maybe you don't even want to hire from there, but great opportunity to become super competitive. I've touched on the nomad visa, but I will say there's more and more countries that where it is socially acceptable to either hire someone on an independent contractor, fixed term contractor, indefinite contractor. Figure out where those countries are. It is on the internet, I promise. And go there first. Start expanding in locations where it is low risk, right? And then I do think the world's best talent doesn't live in your 30-kilometer radius. And so I just think that opportunity is so big. And I think if you are calculating cost per team member, this is your ticket, right? Start looking at what locations doesn't have ridiculous social costs and how does that compete against a US compensation model or a German or Poland or Czech, and start figuring that out, and you'll really become a strategic partner to your go-to-market team, your CEO, etc. Yeah.
Just another skill that an HR person has to have. We have to understand all the global economy. I do think like the one thing I would add is just I have heard so much advice from other HR people, and I'm like, I want to hire globally. And the first thing everyone says is like, find an EOR. And I wish we would stop saying that, honestly, and really come back to like, figure out what works for your company first before you then just go grab a system that's going to basically trick you into thinking you need them. So that's like my one hot tip. But Matt, what are some options? Like you have run a global
Yeah.
company, you started a global company.
Yeah, I think you have to think about incentives when you're talking to these vendors, right? And you have to think about what is the main thing that they sell, right? So if you start looking for EOR companies, don't be surprised, and that company primarily does EOR, don't be surprised they're going to tell you things that make it seem like the EOR is the solution to all of your problems, and you absolutely have to do EOR to be 100% compliant, right? So I always like to, in these cases, try to go with vendors that are sort of like balanced in terms of what they support, that they can do domestic employees, international employees, EOR contractors, and they're not very heavily skewed one way or the other, and they can sort of get your business and support you regardless of which of these flavors you as the customer decide to go with. And whenever you have folks trying to steer you very heavily towards one of the options, just ask yourself, like, do they stand to benefit from this, and how? And this is like especially this happens especially for the EOR servers, because these tend to be priced a lot higher. So whenever someone's like pushing you towards EOR, just think about it. Are they getting more commission out of this? Are they getting more revenue out of this? I think that's like an important question to always ask yourself. And the vendors that are sort of like multi worker type, then they support all of these employment flavors and variations, I think are less likely to do this. They're not you're not entirely sort of immune from this, right? Again, if there's pricing differences between these services, and there almost always will be, there is still, you might still kind of end up in this conversation. But I think if you can find a partner that can give you unbiased advice, and especially when you find yourself getting advice that's like clearly not in the best interest of the partner that you're working with, that's always a good sign, because that usually means that what they care about is a long-term partnership with you, and not short-term extracting the maximum amount of revenue out of that relationship, right? So I always like that with every vendor that we work with, and obviously we use Plain, but for any other product that we buy, I like to see folks not steering me towards the most expensive option, right? And being like, hey, you don't actually need this. You shouldn't be on the enterprise plan, right? You guys are perfectly happy just doing this, and it's cheaper, right? So I always like to look for that in vendors. And I think support, super important, right? And also support for your employees, which I think is a very important factor in here. So there are some folks out there that will just not provide support to your team members. They'll get an autoresponder that says, hey, like, oh, you're an employee, you're not an admin on this account. We can't help you. Go talk to your HR person, right? And if you as a HR leader are picking solutions, wouldn't you rather have something that where your employees can go and talk to someone, and 95% of these cases don't even ever make it up to you, right? So I think getting great support for both the admins and the employees, I think, is critical in choosing these options, especially since the employees and the team members are going to have a lot of questions that you might not have answers to immediately, right? So
I've been in that situation where they've come to ask me, and then I've had to go chat support. And then it's like a back and forth with me, support me, the employee, and I'm just like the intermediary, and it's miserable. I'm like, oh, I just spent my day messaging somebody, and I wish the employee could have just asked their personal questions directly to somebody rather than me, who doesn't know everything.
And I think it also shows how much the vendor cares about the employee and team member experience, right?
Yeah.
And I think ultimately, for a lot of folks, I think on this event, really thinking about doing this people first, right? And your vendors should be thinking about this too. And they should be thinking about, how do I create the same great experience that, we expect as sort of, employees in the US, for example, you're used to having great tools and great things that you can, great platforms that you can use. A lot of folks internationally are not used to that. So quite frankly, the bar for a lot of these experiences is a lot lower. The way that, we try to think about it as Plain is like, we want everyone to have the same great experience, right? And it shouldn't matter if you're an employee or contractor, if you're in the US or South Africa, everyone on your company's team should have the same amazing experience. And quite frankly, they just shouldn't have to think about payroll. It's like, they should be thinking about doing amazing work, and that's why you start companies. You want to build amazing things and help your customers. You shouldn't be thinking about payroll. Let someone else think about it,
I never want to think about payroll. My hot take is like, I think payroll should maybe sit in a different function than HR, but that's like that's a whole separate.
Finance.
That's all
finance.
separate webinar day, like how HR just ends up being like taking on everything from like IT to internal comms to payroll functions that I don't know if they necessarily fall within HR, but that's for another day. I think we're nearing the end of our time together, which makes me so sad because this conversation has been so good and people definitely want a part two. We did get some Q&A, so I would love to just ask one or two of these and see if we can knock them out in the next 6 minutes, Nadia and Matt. But the first question came from Kim, and she said, how are folks identifying which markets to hire in when scaling globally? Are folks targeting hubs? Or are they fully open to hiring anywhere around the globe?
To
What do you
me,
think?
as someone that's been doing this for a while, you literally do have companies like my current employer, Camunda, GitLab, Remote.com, Test Gorilla. I mean, I can name 20 companies that is literally hiring anywhere. The list of countries they can't hire in is typically locations that is either under sanction or there's a very specific reason, and they would be clear on what those countries are. That being said, my favorite way of doing this is go to VP of Sales or Chief Revenue Officer and go, what is your go-to-market plan? Right? Because if they have a go-to-market plan, you are going to need to know where you're going to scale. And if that isn't in one location, you want to make sure you've got those languages, locations down, people that are in the location. If it's sales folks, sometimes they do have to meet a customer in person. And so if they're not in country, it becomes really complex. So I love that partnership. I would also say I do like the strategic element of like, right, we've scaled now in the UK, US, let's say Netherlands, Germany, and maybe one Asia Pacific country. Do we want to expand APAC, Americas? Are we going to expand beyond the US and Canada, for example, right? And then start figuring out what locations have we not even spoken about, and what does the cost of hiring in those locations look like? What are the risks? And then mapping it out like that. I used to have this amazing like risk scale at GitLab that was very transparent for anyone internally to view, to understand what are we doing and why, where are we setting boundaries. And that was a great indicator for me to know I need to start an entity, or I need to ask my vendor to help me start an entity because I don't know how to do it. And so I think that's it, right? You need some sort of plan. I think when you just decide to go global, companies like Camunda is very comfortable with the ambiguity of that. I'm very comfortable with that, but many companies aren't, and many CEOs or leadership teams simply aren't. So ask them, where are we expanding? Why are we expanding there? How can I enable that? Yeah.
And one thing to add to that is I think even if you have the solutions for employing folks in a lot of different markets, you need to think about how you're going to get candidates, right? So I think it's sort of like one thing to be, okay, if someone applies and they're amazing, doesn't matter where they are. But then if you're actually going to be sourcing people, proactively trying to build up your candidate pool, that's a lot harder to do on a truly global, indiscriminate scale, right? Because a lot of the tools that will help you reach talent are not 100% global, right? I mean, LinkedIn is, but a lot of the local job boards might not be, right? Different countries have also different pools and different depths of talent pools in different technologies, different stacks, different skill sets, right? So if you're looking for, let's say, Python engineers, you might have better luck in sort of country A versus country B. And that's often for historical reasons. It could be because a big company like, Microsoft, for example, uses a lot of C# and they had a big IT sort of developer office in Romania, right? And therefore there is a lot of talent in that with that specific sort of language skill set in that market that you can tap into, and you move just, a couple of 100 miles, and you hop on across the border to another country, and you might have a very different distribution of the skills that you're going to find available in that market, right? So I think the sort of like what type of talent you're going to be looking for, and how much of that is kind of inbound to your business versus outbound, is going to inform whether you're going to go with the hub strategy or the kind of like we're just going to hire anywhere strategy, and that the talent that you need, the specific skill set, are also going to have an impact on that.
I love that. We have 60 seconds left, but I have to ask. Some people are asking good resources for US-based employers to get a baseline understanding of international hiring or employment laws. Any tips?
I'm going to plug my office hours. So if anyone needs more advice and just wants to chat, I do open office hours every month. It's not a sales conversation. I just like to help people. I've done this myself, built up these global teams, and I don't want anyone to have to go through the same pains that I've gone through. So we're going to send out, I think, an invite to my office hours. It's a one-on-one conversation with me. You're not going to be talking to a salesperson. And I'm happy to help out however I can.
I love that. That'll be in the follow-up email to this event. With that, we are at time. Thank you so, so much to everybody who spent an hour with us today talking about killer global hiring strategies. Big thanks to Matt and Nadia for dropping so many nuggets of good information. When we send the follow-up email, we'll also include ways to connect with them and to get some office time with Matt. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great Halloween, and I will see all of you soon, hopefully.
Thanks, everyone. This was awesome.
Bye.
Bye.